The laughter hung in the air like a dare, sharp and bright, before dissolving into the kind of silence that makes even the hum of fluorescent lights seem deafening. Inside the polished private hangar of Morgan Aviation, eyes darted between two figures standing worlds apart in every sense but proximity. Elizabeth Morgan, immaculate in her tailored Navy suit, exuded the kind of power that could silence a room without speaking. Jack Harlow, in oil-stained coveralls and steel-toed boots, stood across from her with the unhurried calm of someone used to being underestimated. It was an absurd tableau. The reigning queen of private aviation staring down a man who looked more at home under the hood of a pickup truck. A local garage mechanic thinks he can fix a Gulfstream's Pratt & Whitney engine, Elizabeth said, her voice glacial, the words carefully sharpened. This isn't changing the oil in a family sedan, Mr. Harlow. That's a $15 million piece of engineering brilliance. I need certified aerospace technicians, not. Her gaze lingered on his worn coveralls, the faint smudge of grease on his jawline. Overconfident handymen playing with toys they don't understand. Jack didn't flinch. If the comment landed, it didn't show. What she couldn't see beneath the stained fabric was the truth. The man she was dismissing had once been a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in aerospace engineering circles. A man who designed propulsion systems that had altered the trajectory of entire programs. A man who had walked away from all of it. At 38, his hands carried the record of those years, calluses built not just from wrenching bolts, but from solving the kind of problems that made other engineers sweat. 5 years ago, after his wife's sudden death, he'd left that world behind without ceremony, without farewell tours, without anything but a single suitcase and a young daughter named Lily. Westridge, the small town that smelled of coffee and rain-soaked asphalt, had offered something that MIT labs and military contracts never could: stability. A 2-bedroom apartment above a diner. Mornings that began with making his daughter's lunch, not checking his email for defense updates. Afternoons in a local auto shop, where fixing a truck's transmission felt just as real as testing a jet's engine. Evenings that were sacred: dinner, homework, laughter. No corporate dinners, no endless flights, no missed birthdays. On the wall of their living room, there were no framed diplomas, no awards. Only Lily's hand-painted art, her school certificates. His own credentials were locked away in a small metal box at the back of his closet, alongside Metal's old photographs, and one folded letter he hadn't read in years. Elizabeth Morgan, on the other hand, was everything he'd left behind. The daughter of a military pilot turned entrepreneur, she'd risen to power with surgical precision, MIT summa cum laude, Harvard MBA, then CEO of her father's struggling charter service at 29. She'd forged Morgan Aviation into a titan of private travel, a name whispered by CEOs and movie stars alike when they needed discretion and perfection. She was 42 now, and her life ran like a flight plan. 5 a.m. training session, breakfast meeting, operational review, strategy call, late-night email marathons. No family photos in her office, only awards, business magazine covers, and the sleek model of a Gulfstream G650 perched like a crown jewel on her desk. Her reputation was as cold as the titanium she demanded in her aircraft. 2 broken engagements had taught her that love required compromise, and compromise was an unaffordable luxury in her pursuit of excellence. The only living creature who saw her without armor was Churchill, her British short-hair cat. The call that would bring her face-to-face with Jack again came on a stormy Friday at 3:42 p.m. Her operations director entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that said more than his words ever could. The Sullivan Party's G650 has an engine issue, he reported, tension threading his voice. They're grounded at Westridge. Diagnostics are inconclusive. Our nearest certified team is stuck in Boston. Weather delay, at least 4 hours. Elizabeth's mind moved instantly to the client in question, James Sullivan, billionaire tech magnate, considering a partnership that could take Morgan Aviation national. Losing him wasn't an option. She ordered a helicopter. He told her air traffic was grounded below 10,000 feet. Sullivan was already threatening to call competitors. Elizabeth grabbed her coat. She'd drive. The 90-minute trip to Westridge was a blur of rain-smeared roads, phone calls, and contingency plans. By the time she stepped into the hangar, Sullivan was pacing like a caged animal. His security detail flanked the gleaming, silent Gulfstream. Elizabeth scanned the local crew, nervous, unqualified, and then her gaze caught on a familiar figure bent over the engine cowling. Jack Harlow. She remembered him vaguely from the time her Porsche had broken down outside Westridge. Back then, she'd assumed he was just another competent small-town mechanic. "What is he doing here?" she asked sharply. "Called in because he's got a knack for." "This isn't a carburetor problem," she cut in. "Get him away from that engine before he makes it worse." Jack straightened, met her eyes. "The fault isn't mechanical," he said evenly. "It's in the digital fuel management system. Programming conflict between the latest software update and the emergency protocols." Elizabeth's irritation sharpened. "And you determined that how?" "By checking the oil." But minutes later, when she ran her own diagnostics, the results were identical to his assessment. She didn't like the feeling in her gut, the one that said she'd just dismissed a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. Pride told her to wait for her team. Reality told her she had 47 minutes to solve this before Sullivan walked. And Jack Harlow, against every instinct she had, might be her only option. Elizabeth Morgan had been in enough high-pressure negotiations to recognize the exact moment a choice narrowed into two unpalatable options. Option 1, wait for the certified team, adhere to protocol, and watch Sullivan's jet get towed to a competitor's hangar by sunset. Option 2, trust a man she'd just publicly dismissed whose resume, if it even existed, was probably written in grease pencil. Neither appealed to her ego, but one would save the contract. Sullivan's polished loafers echoed on the concrete as he stepped into the hangar, impatience radiating off him like heat from a tarmac. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice clipped. "My board members are already looking for alternative transport. You have 45 minutes before I sign elsewhere." Elizabeth didn't blink. "We've identified the issue and are implementing the fix," she replied, knowing full well we, at that moment, consisted of her, a rainstorm, and one infuriating mechanic. She turned to leave, but movement in her peripheral vision caught her eye. Jack, methodically packing his tools. No grandstanding, no parting shot, just quiet preparation to disappear back into the life she assumed he belonged to. "Mr. Harlow," she called, her tone still cool, but no longer dismissive. "You mentioned a programming conflict. Explain." He met her gaze, assessing whether she was genuinely listening this time. "The emergency fuel bypass system thinks the new software is a hostile takeover. It's forcing a shutdown loop." Her mind ticked over the data she just reviewed. He was right. Dead on. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "Yes." "How long?" 20 minutes. 15 if no one interrupts. Elizabeth studied him. No arrogance, no false modesty, just precision. The kind she valued. "Do it," she said. Then added, "I'll be watching every move." Jack gave a small nod and opened a battered backpack. Inside wasn't the clunky laptop she expected, but a top-grade industrial diagnostic tablet. He plugged into the Gulfstream system, and his fingers began moving over the screen with the kind of ease she'd only seen in elite engineers. Elizabeth stood close enough to observe, her curiosity gnawing at the edges of her focus. He navigated menus most techs avoided without guidance. When he hit a security wall, he looked up. "I'll need your override codes." The request was no small thing. Company policy dictated those codes stayed locked in her head. She hesitated only a heartbeat before leaning in to type them herself. It felt oddly like handing him a loaded weapon and trusting him not to turn it. Minutes passed in a rhythm of rapid keystrokes and system beeps. Sullivan's shadow loomed closer, his arms folded, ready to pounce. "You're certified engineer?" the billionaire asked, his tone cutting. "Just finishing the bypass," Jack answered before she could. There was authority in his voice, calm, absolute. Even Sullivan seemed momentarily disarmed. 13 minutes later, Jack disconnected his tablet. Fired up. The engine roared to life, smooth as glass. No error lights. No shutdown loop. Sullivan's pilot ran the checklist and gave a single nod. All green. The relief in the hangar was almost tangible, though Elizabeth's came laced with an uncomfortable truth. She had been outperformed in her own domain by a man she'd underestimated twice in one afternoon. Sullivan, mollified, offered her the closest thing to praise he ever gave. Adequate response, Morgan. Our meeting next week stands. When the entourage departed, Elizabeth turned back, intending to offer Jack some form of professional acknowledgement, if not gratitude, then at least respect. She found him in the break room, washing his hands, coveralls unzipped to reveal a plain, white t-shirt. As he reached for a paper towel, the sleeve rode up, revealing part of a tattoo. Precise geometric lines, not decorative but functional. Recognition jolted her. That's a Pratt & Whitney schematic, she said, stepping closer. PW1000G geared turbofan. Proprietary. Only a handful of engineers ever saw that version. Jack froze, pulling the fabric down. A reminder of another life. Elizabeth's voice sharpened. 16 people had access to those specs. He looked at her for a long moment, resignation settling in his expression. 17. I led the modification team. The name dropped into her mind like a stone through still water. Dr. Jonathan Harlow. MIT prodigy. Threshold Aerospace's gold mine. The engineer whose disappearance had been whispered about for years in industry corridors. You vanished, she said softly. No one knew why. My wife died, he answered, blunt and unornamented. Brain aneurysm. One day, she was helping Lily with homework. The next, I was everything. His voice caught, not in weakness, but in the finality of loss. Elizabeth, for once, had nothing to say. In that quiet hangar, she realized the man before her wasn't just an unsung genius. He was a father who had made a choice she could barely fathom, trading the highest echelons of his field for presence in a small-town life. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth Morgan wasn't entirely sure which life was the greater achievement. The Sullivan jet sliced into the clearing skies, a silver arrow disappearing into the clouds. Normally, Elizabeth would have been halfway back to Boston by now, her mind already shifting to the next client, the next deal. But instead, she stood motionless on the Westridge tarmac, the cool air pressing against her like a question she didn't know how to answer. Jack Harlow had just done in under 15 minutes what her elite team in Boston would have needed hours, and a hangar full of resources to accomplish. And he'd walked away without so much as a request for payment, recognition, or future work. That kind of restraint was foreign to her world. Inside the small, coffee-scented airport cafe, Elizabeth opened her tablet and pulled up the search bar. Her fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second. Digging into someone's history without consent wasn't her style, but she rationalized it as due diligence. A few keystrokes later, his story began to unfold. Jonathan Jack Harlow, doctorate from MIT at 26, key propulsion patents, Aerospace Engineering Medal of Excellence. Photos of him on podiums, smiling in tailored suits, shaking hands with military brass. Then, 5 years ago, he vanished from public view. The articles were full of speculation, government secrecy, burnout, internal politics. None of them mentioned a wife's sudden death or a 7-year-old girl who had just lost her mother. Elizabeth closed the screen. Her own father's absence had been constant, though not from tragedy. Business dinners, contract negotiations, endless flights. Always another meeting that mattered more. She remembered standing alone at her middle school science fair, blue ribbon in hand, her father's seat empty. He'd congratulated her days later, in passing, as though her award were just another line item in the ledger of her life. That moment had hardened something in her. If excellence couldn't buy presence, then at least it could command respect. And now here was Jack Harlow, a man who had abandoned the very respect she had spent her life chasing, and somehow he didn't seem diminished by it. The cafe door opened. Elizabeth glanced up instinctively and froze. Jack entered with a girl beside him, her energy bright enough to cut through the drizzle outside. She had her father's watchful eyes and a smile that could have belonged to her mother. Lily. Jack was wholly absorbed in her as they ordered hot chocolates, leaning down to catch every word of her animated story. He laughed, an unguarded, unself-conscious sound Elizabeth could not imagine leaving her own mouth in public. It made her feel like an intruder, as though she were watching something private and sacred. When he noticed her in the corner booth, he gave a polite nod. Nothing more. No invitation to join them. No pointed glance at the empty seat across from him. It wasn't dismissal, but a quiet declaration. This time belongs to her. Elizabeth stayed until their drinks arrived, pretending to read emails. She told herself she was only observing, but she was learning something without wanting to. There was a power in the way Jack had reordered his life around one small person, not the power of dominance or control, but the kind that came from knowing exactly what mattered and acting accordingly. It was unsettling. She had built her career on the idea that excellence required sacrifice. And here was a man who seemed to prove that maybe it didn't, at least not in the way she'd always believed. When she finally left, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. She slipped into her Range Rover, but instead of driving away, she sat for a moment, listening to the percussion of water on the roof. Elizabeth Morgan was not used to feeling envy. And yet, watching Jack with his daughter, she'd felt a tug deep enough to disturb the bedrock of her convictions. She wasn't sure what to do with that. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth was stepping out of a boardroom, expansion plans approved, champagne waiting in crystal flutes, when her phone rang. Her operations director's voice carried an urgency she didn't often hear. The test flight for the modified Gulfstream. There's been an incident. No injuries, but she's grounded at Westridge. Engine trouble. Initial diagnostics point to the custom modifications we installed last month. Elizabeth stopped in the hallway. Contact the engineering team in Boston. That's the problem, he said. The modifications are proprietary. Our regular team isn't certified, and the lead engineer is in Europe until tomorrow. It would take 24 hours to get the right people in place. The military procurement team was scheduled to see the aircraft in less than that. Delay meant embarrassment. Embarrassment meant leverage lost. She didn't think long. I'll handle it personally. 90 minutes later, her Aston Martin was parked outside Miller's auto shop, looking like it had taken a wrong turn on its way to a gala. The receptionist blinked at her tailored suit. I need to speak to Jack Harlow. He emerged from beneath a lifted Subaru, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression carried recognition and a flicker of wary amusement. Miss Morgan, another luxury car problem. A jet problem, she said evenly. May I speak to you privately? In the cramped break room, she laid out the situation with surgical precision, stripped of any condescension. The thrust vectoring system is showing cascading failures. We have 24 hours before the demo. I believe you're the best qualified within 100 miles. Jack leaned back, studying her. Why come to me? Because I've seen how you solve problems, she replied simply. He glanced toward the shop floor. I have responsibilities here. And Lily. She's welcome in our client lounge, Elizabeth offered. Wi-Fi, snacks, comfortable seating. And I've authorized expedited payment. Triple your normal consultation rate. His brow quirked. You researched my hourly rate? I research everything, Mr. Harlow. It's why Morgan Aviation succeeds. After a moment, he nodded. Let me make a call. At the airfield, Elizabeth shed her suit jacket for Morgan Aviation coveralls, a sight that drew more than a few double takes from a staff. She wasn't there to hover. She was there to work. Side by side, she and Jack disassembled the system, trading observations like seasoned partners. When she suggested an adjustment to his approach, he considered it, then incorporated it without hesitation. By evening, they'd found the fault, a miscalibrated hydraulic component in the custom mod. The fix required precision, but between her access to parts and his hands-on expertise, they had the system humming by nightfall. Elizabeth ordered dinner to the hangar. What started as a professional courtesy evolved into a rare, unguarded conversation. They swapped stories of engineering innovations, moments of failure, and the peculiar satisfaction of solving problems others had written off as impossible. Jack's watch beeped quietly. He glanced at it. I need to call Lily. Bedtime routine. Use my office, Elizabeth said. Through the glass wall, she could see him on the phone. His expression softened in a way she'd never seen before, laughter, warmth, a presence that had nothing to do with engines. It startled her. How different he seemed when his focus wasn't a machine, but a person. When the work was done, she insisted on driving him home. The modest apartment above the Main Street diner was tidy, shelves lined with engineering textbooks alongside middle school science kits. Lily was asleep, her desk scattered with parts and notes from a science project, a model aircraft with detailed calculations. She wants to build engines that don't use fossil fuels, Jack said quietly. Told me, my generation hasn't solved the problems that matter. Elizabeth looked at him. She reminds me of you. How so? The precision. The refusal to accept limitations. Something unspoken passed between them then, a recognition of shared values beneath entirely different life choices. 3 days after the late-night hangar fix, Morgan Aviation's modified Gulfstream dazzled at the demonstration. The military procurement team toured the aircraft, asked sharp questions, and left impressed. By the end of the week, Elizabeth had the provisional contract in hand. Her assistant slid a standard thank you letter across her desk for Jack. Elizabeth picked it up, stared at the sterile corporate phrasing, then set it aside. 3 discarded drafts later, she wrote by hand. Your expertise was invaluable. Morgan Aviation would welcome your consultation on future projects, on your terms, respecting your priorities. P.S. The modified thrust system has performed flawlessly. Your daughter would be proud of the engineering. A week passed before an envelope appeared on her desk, hand-delivered. Inside was a neatly sketched hydraulic redesign, annotated in precise engineering script. A thought experiment for your next project. Lily suggested the alternative pressure valve configuration. Elizabeth found herself smiling, not at the brilliance of the idea, though it was sharp, but at the fact that it had come from both of them. She called him. Morgan Aviation is launching a scholarship for young women in aerospace engineering, she said after brief pleasantries. I'd like to discuss Lily being in the first cohort. Over coffee. They met at the Westridge Bookstore Cafe. It was supposed to be a 30-minute professional meeting. 2 hours later, they were still there, deep in conversation about engineering ethics, mentorship, and eventually, life choices. You never returned to aerospace, Elizabeth said carefully. Not after Emma died, Jack replied. The hours didn't fit being the parent Lily needed. But you still design, she noted, referencing the sketch. Sometimes old habits, he admitted. You miss it. He thought for a long moment. I miss the collaboration, the chance to build something meaningful. But I'm building something meaningful now, too. His eyes met hers. She knew he meant Lily, but there was something else in that look. Weeks passed. Coffee meetings became a rhythm. Elizabeth found reasons to be in Westridge that had nothing to do with aircraft. The scholarship program grew, with Lily and 4 other girls mentored by Morgan Aviation engineers. Jack consulted on specialized projects, his solutions implemented without him ever re-entering the corporate grind. One crisp autumn evening, walking from the cafe to his apartment after a particularly challenging problem-solving session, Elizabeth spoke first. We're colleagues with common interests, she began. But I look forward to these talks more than most board meetings. That suggests more than professional compatibility. Jack smiled, a real one. I've noticed you check your phone less when you're here. And Lily says it's weird but nice how often you're in Westridge. Observant like her father, Elizabeth said, her voice softer than she intended. He let his hand brush hers, not quite taking it. I've built my life around being present for what matters. Lately, these conversations matter to me, too. 6 months later, Morgan Aviation's annual showcase glittered under bright hangar lights. The centerpiece was a hybrid propulsion system, drawing industry leaders like moths to a flame. Elizabeth's assistant approached. Your guests are in your office. Inside, Jack and Lily were adjusting the display model she'd built for the young engineer section. At 12.5, Lily had the poise of someone who knew her work was good, and the calculations to prove it. It runs perfectly, Lily announced. Dad checked my math twice. Elizabeth smiled. I'd expect nothing less. As Lily fine-tuned her display, Jack joined Elizabeth by the window overlooking the event. Second thoughts about inviting the local mechanic to your prestigious industry night, he teased. On the contrary, she replied. Dr. Harlow's presence adds credibility. His face grew serious. I'm not returning to that world, Elizabeth. Not even for you. I'm not asking you to. I'm creating a consulting division for engineers with family commitments, remote work, project-based contracts, school-hour schedules. Jack raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like the efficiency-obsessed CEO I first met. She's reconsidering certain priorities, Elizabeth said, her hand finding his. Excellence doesn't always mean sacrifice. Sometimes it means balance. From across the room, Lily looked over. She noticed the joined hands, considered it for a moment, then gave a small nod, an almost imperceptible approval. Elizabeth didn't move. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be still, to imagine a future that wasn't measured entirely in contracts signed or miles flown. Jack's hand tightened around hers. Some engines, she thought, weren't meant to run at full throttle forever. The most important journeys weren't about altitude or speed, but about the distance between who you were and who you could become.